As in all the sweetest music, a tinge of sadness was in every note. Nor do we know how much of the pleasures, even of life, we owe to the intermingled sorrows. This is Pints with Jack, Season 7, Episode 35, MacDonald Month, George's Music, After Hours with Dr. Amanda Vernon. Welcome everyone, and here on Pints with Jack, we're reading our way through the works of C.S. Lewis, but this month we are reading his master, George MacDonald. And we continue that today, and we're going to devote this episode to the question of MacDonald's relationship with music. And our guide through this particular slice of MacDonald's life and his writing is Dr. Amanda Vernon. Dr. Amanda Vernon completed an MA in English Literary Studies at the University of Exeter, a diploma in Theological Studies at the University of Oxford, and a BA in English Literature at the University of Buckingham. She completed her PhD at the University of Lancaster, and her thesis was entitled Reading with the Trinity, and looked at the relationship between theology and literary form in the work of George MacDonald, examining the relationship between 19th century religious and literary culture, while also demonstrating how MacDonald's theological approach to literary criticism made him a distinctive contributor to this emergent field. Dr. Amanda Vernon, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
How's the weather in Oxford today?
It is pretty grey. It's not raining though, which I always see as, the optimum. As long as it's not raining, then it's fine. But yeah, we're lacking sunshine.
That's a very English response, and I absolutely love it.
Yeah. I've lived here long enough to understand.
Well, I was going to be enjoying some tea today, but I changed my mind at the last minute, and I went with a Best Day Brewing White Belgian-style wheat beer. Are you drinking anything today?
I am. I'm having coffee. I'm having my afternoon caffeine hit. Excellent
choice. Cheers.
Cheers.
So would you mind just introducing yourself and filling out a little bit more of your background? As we were talking over email, you said that you're also in a period of transition at the moment. So what are you going to be doing next?
Yes, I am. In September, I am moving to Germany to take up a research and teaching fellowship there for a year at the University of Tübingen. So that's exciting. I've been teaching in the UK and so I need to work on that. I've been doing my Duolingo, so I think I'll be prepared.
Oh, yes. Sehr gut.
Yeah.
I did 3 years of German in high school, and I hated every second of it. And I've basically forgotten all of it. I think you just heard the entirety of the vocabulary that has stayed in my head. You'd never guess I got an A at GCSE.
Well, yeah, hopefully I can pick something. Thankfully, I'll be teaching in English, so that's good. Otherwise, I would have some trouble. But
Well, before you enjoy the Wiener Schnitzel, let's roll the clock back. What has your career been? What does it look like? Your interest in literature, literary theory, and George MacDonald?
Yeah, so I have studied pretty much all the way through literature, apart from a little stint doing some theology. And I focused on MacDonald in my PhD thesis, looking at his literary criticism, his work as a literary scholar. But I'm a Victorianist, so I work more generally on the 19th century and specifically on theology and literature in the 19th century. So yeah, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from the UK, I'm from Ohio, but came over to do my undergrad here and then just stayed.
People have been known to do that.
Yeah, it happens.
I say this as I'm looking out on a beautiful Wisconsin day.
Yes, Midwest. It's very good.
Mm-hmm. And so when did you first discover MacDonald, and when did he become an actual area of study for you?
So I read him when I was a child. We had his fairy tales. My mom still has loads of books around, and I was one of those kids that just, voraciously read everything. So I got a hold of MacDonald on some bookshelf somewhere, and I still have a very distinct memory of reading The Princess and the Goblin and being terrified of the goblin's creatures, and the moment where Princess Irene wakes up and there's this terrifying creature, where she thinks there's a terrifying long-legged cat creature in her bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a little scary for me as a kid. So I knew his fairy tales when I was little, and then kind of forgot. I didn't really forget about him, but I just didn't really think about him until I got to my undergraduate. And I was working in part on Alice in Wonderland for my dissertation. and kind of had an interest in Victorian children's literature. And then I stumbled across MacDonald and a chapter on MacDonald and Stephen Prickett's book on Victorian fantasy. And I went, oh yeah, MacDonald. And I went away and read some of his work and was just blown away. I'd grown up a little bit, just a little bit at that point, and was just amazed by how theologically rich his writing was. And so I wanted to dig into that more. So I did my master's dissertation on his fairy tales, looking at theology in his fairy tales. And then, well, there's definitely more here. So I'll do a PhD. And I think I'll be reading MacDonald for the rest of my life, because there's, he's not somebody, you can go back to him again and again and really gain a lot from him, I think. And he bears rereading, which I think is, sort of the definition of a classic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And his corpus is not exactly small.
No, it's not. It's not. I guess he's probably best known for his fairy tales, maybe his unspoken sermons and his nonfiction theology. But he also wrote, he's got a book of essays called A Dish of Orts.
Yeah.
Orts are leftovers. So he kind of modestly titled this book A Dish of Leftovers. And it has the most incredible essays on a variety of subjects, some of which are really interesting essays on Shakespeare. And there's one called A Sketch of Individual Development, where he kind of talks about, it's very psychological analysis of a person's development and kind of spiritual development. And yeah, so definitely not just leftovers, but so he's written all sorts of interesting things.
Now we'll get to the question of music in a moment, but when you were doing your studies on his theology in his stories, what were the sort of topics and themes that sort of came up in that examination?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think for MacDonald, probably I would say the number one key word would be imagination. And that's what I was looking specifically at, was his kind of theology of the imagination. That, I think, also development, spiritual development, the ideas of growth and development. And there's always a movement of some kind. You're either moving forward and developing in a good direction. He would say, beastward, either backwards or more towards the kind of perfected man or woman. So yeah, I think those would be the two things that immediately come to mind when thinking about some of his themes in his fairy stories, would be the kind of theological insights that you can gain, even revelation, I would say, from using the imagination, and then how that might help develop you, or how you might grow in some way.
And those are all very Lewisian themes as well. Since I am very much a MacDonald novice, as I've started reading his books, I'm starting to understand why every MacDonald fan I know, they give me a little roll of the eyes when they know that I'm big into C.S. Lewis. It's like, he just stole it all from MacDonald.
Yeah.
But for example, when you talk about that development, you regress into this beastward mode, we would call that heavenly and hellish creatures from Mere Christianity. Mm-hmm. This idea of development. Lewis doesn't use the word, but I've read enough of his stuff to know that his theology of theosis is just throughout his works. He never uses the word, but there's always this idea that we are being transformed from one thing into another.
Yeah.
And it's just a question of what that transformation looks like. And literally this morning, I finished The Princess and the Goblin. And there, again, even in that book, I saw lots of echoes of things that I recognize from Narnia. A bird coming down a sunbeam is like, well, that's got echoes of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader all over it.
Yeah.
And the idea of what you can and what you cannot see. That's Prince Caspian. That's Till We Have Faces.
Absolutely. The Last Battle.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And this repeated appeal to the imagination. I mean, Lewis wrote essays directly on it, speaking about it being the organ of meaning, whereas the mind is the organ of truth. Mm-hmm. And all I'll say is, MacDonald's nerds who keep sending me emails and messages, I get it. I do get it, and I'm starting to appreciate that now.
Well, I always say, I mean, I completely agree, because I'm one of those people that's always like, oh, come on. But Lewis was a very, very good academic, and he always cited his sources. I think it's just a matter of us not paying enough attention to the fact that he was, constantly saying, this isn't mine. Got this from somebody else. But so to his credit, he was very good at that.
And he said that he barely ever wrote a book where he wasn't quoting or alluding to MacDonald.
Yeah.
So this is also, I've said it a couple of times so far in this MacDonald Month, but this is really my mea culpa for neglecting MacDonald for this long. My favorite author has been telling me to read this guy forever. So I'm now trying to do that.
Well, he's worth reading. He can be a little, I think, tricky in some spots, but absolutely worth pursuing it or finding something that speaks to you in some way. I think from MacDonald's work.
Well, today we are talking about MacDonald and music. So what was his relationship with music? Was he musical himself? Did he come from a musical family?
Yeah, so music is kind of everywhere in MacDonald's writing. He has these incredibly rich, evocative descriptions of music, mostly in his novels. But he's kind of always alluding to, I would say, nature and music, and they kind of go hand in hand. And then he wrote songs, so there are songs interspersed often in the narratives of his novels, especially his fantasy work. So Fantastes has these kind of moments where there are several stanzas of a song or verses of a song.
I do think they're a little bit like Tolkien and his songs. When you first start reading him, you go, I'm just going to skip over this bit. But when you start rereading, you start paying attention a little bit more because there's usually something happening there.
Yes, there is usually something happening. Yeah, it's not a kind of self-indulgent little, I mean, MacDonald did want to be a poet, so, but I don't think it's kind of his opportunity to slip some poetry in without you noticing. In terms of his relationship with music, kind of more biographically, so obviously he's got all this musical writing in his books, but it began a little bit more ambiguously, I guess you could say, in his history growing up. I don't want to rehash too much, biographical stuff, but I think it is helpful just to have a little bit of a sense of the context that he was raised in and what he was coming from, because I think that shaped so much of his writing, the topics that he was interested in writing about, and in relationship to music, certainly, because it does feature quite a bit in his work. So, as your listeners might know, he was born in Huntly in Aberdeenshire in 1824. He died in 1905, and I am really bad with dates. So the way that I remember that is I made a little mnemonic for myself because people kept asking me, what are MacDonald's dates? 1905, he did not survive. So that one's for free. You can keep that one. So now you'll know when he died. So he kind of spanned the entire, Victorian period over the reign of Victoria. She died in 1901, I think. So he was born in Huntly in Aberdeenshire. And his immediate family, his father and the other members of his immediate and some of his extended family, were fairly moderate and open when it came to religious matters. There was some diversity of opinion in that regard. But this is not so much the case with his wider context. So a lot of the environment that he was raised in, the kind of school that he went to and all of that, and some members of his family were very influenced by a kind of quite a severe version of federal Calvinism. And the impression that you get from MacDonald's writings about that, because it's very present throughout his writings that he's kind of addressing this, is that there was an emphasis on kind of believing the right things. He was quizzed every day in school, making sure that he knew the Westminster Shorter Catechism. So there's that kind of an emphasis on that and kind of keeping your nose clean a little bit. So a lot of fear that things might lead you astray or might perhaps indicate that you're not one of the elect. So just staying kind of very safely within the lines of certain things. And so within this context, things like music and other aesthetic delights, like imaginative literature and things like that, were often viewed with suspicion, if not opposed outright. This is a kind of famous MacDonald. You probably have heard this famous MacDonald story of his grandmother, who was a little bit more on the side of this more severe version of their religious tradition, burning her son's violin. So that's MacDonald's uncle, because she was concerned about the moral impact, negative impact it might have on him. And that was not entirely unheard of. So there were other clergy people who would sometimes burn people's instruments and kind of, the message being, we're making a little fire now, but it's going to kind of save you from the big fire of hell. So quite intense. But the kind of message that MacDonald seems to have absorbed in this context is that there is some kind of an opposition or a tension between music and literature and other aesthetic things, even nature, even the kind of aesthetic value of nature, and the Christian faith. We kind of can see this a little bit. So in 1847, he had finished his studies. He studied at Aberdeen University, finished his studies. He moved down to London and was there for a couple of years tutoring. He was working as a private tutor, kind of trying to figure out what he was doing. He was interested in studying science, but he didn't have the funds to do that. And he wanted to be a poet. And he was kind of discerning a call to the ministry. So he was a Congregationalist. So he was trying to figure out if he wanted to pursue that, if that was something for him. So he writes to his father, who he remains very close to throughout his life. So he's 23 years old at this point, and he writes to him as he's kind of talking about processing this call to ministry. One of my greatest difficulties in consenting to think of religion was that I thought I should have to give up my beautiful thoughts and my love for the things God has made. And he goes on to explain how he resolves this. And he concludes that God is the God of the beautiful, religion, the love of the beautiful, and kind of more specifically related to our topic, in one of his sermons later that he publishes, his unspoken sermons, he kind of concludes that God is the God of music, of painting, of building, the Lord of hosts, the God of mountains and oceans. This is a very quick, indicator of the journey that he went on from wondering if these things were compatible to finally kind of coming to a place where he thought, no, this is actually not just compatible, but God is the God of music. And I think that highlights a little bit this idea, this tension that he was experiencing. And I think in a lot of ways that really shaped some of the topics that he was very interested in depicting in his fiction. So I mentioned a moment ago the story of his grandmother burning the fiddle. And he kind of very famously fictionalizes this, famously to MacDonald people. I know that's not very famously, but he sort of famously fictionalizes this in his novel that he published in 1868 called Robert Falconer. So there's a young man in this who gets his hands on his grandfather's violin, and he just loves this violin. And he figures out a way to learn. He takes lessons with this cobbler who's a fiddler in the village or the town where he lives. And he kind of keeps it a secret because he knows his grandmother isn't going to approve. He's being raised by his grandmother, who is perhaps similarly to MacDonald's grandmother, kind of very strict. She's got a beautiful heart and is full of love, but MacDonald kind of depicts her as being a bit, squished because of her theology. So he's very generous towards people, I would say, when he depicts them for the most part. His critique is of a theological system and what that might do to somebody's kind of spirituality, their spiritual life, and their relationship with God. So in this story, in Robert Falconer, there's a scene where the violin is burnt by the grandmother. Spoiler alert, I should have said that before. But so she kind of takes the violin back, and she thinks that this kid is going to perdition because he's playing the violin, So she throws it in the fire, and then other things, she kind of keeps him from engaging with music in other ways throughout the novel. Yeah, so that's obviously, it was very significant, that story, at least for MacDonald, and that context that he was raised in. And he often writes kind of autobiographically in his realist novels. Yeah, so that's the beginning. So when he's in London, he meets Louisa Powell, who would become his wife. And the Powell family were very musical. So Louisa played the piano and sang. Her father was a very accomplished violinist. And he used to have these quartet parties, and they would have a woman named Clara Macaron, who was Mendelssohn's favorite violin student, would come and play with them. And so lots of music making going on. And then MacDonald, when he went on to have children, their children played violin and piano. John Ruskin, who was a good friend of the MacDonalds, gifted them a piano, which is a pretty nice gift, along with some Turner paintings. I want to be Ruskin's friend.
Just as an aside, the more I learn about MacDonald, he's the most well-connected guy ever.
Oh,
he knows everybody.
Yeah.
You mentioned Alice in Wonderland earlier. I remember when I discovered, he knew Lewis Carroll, Mark Twain, everybody.
Yeah, he did. It's really amazing. It is. the more you read about him, the more you think, oh my gosh, he knew. And all these social reformers in London, I could do a list. But anyway, so yeah, he was incredibly well connected, and also didn't really, he was well connected in a kind of, he wasn't somebody who's trying to take advantage of networks, as far as I can tell. He was very much just a kind of, oh, this person has mutual interests. And, he wasn't interested in kind of being in the midst of these fashionable literary circles. I think he just kind of wanted to do his own thing. So, to some extent, I guess he was involved with, at least adjacent to some famous musicians in London. Musical family, once he was married, and he kind of married into a musical family. MacDonald himself was not really a musician. So I'm not sure whether that's because he didn't have an opportunity growing up. I think part of it might have been maybe that wasn't his strongest point of gifting, but that is perhaps speculation on my part. So his wife writes to him that in his soul, she writes in a letter, in his soul, he's truly musical, even if he doesn't know music, and even if he cannot sing the simplest hymn tunes, which I assume means he can't read music, kind of sheet music. I'm not sure whether not being able to sing the simplest hymn tunes means he can't carry a tune, or whether it means he just can't read simple music. I'm not sure. We will leave that. And MacDonald kind of knew that himself. So he writes to his wife in 89 about some singing that he was out on a lecture tour, and he was staying with somebody, and he says, we had some nice, though no doubt imperfect, singing yesterday. All that I know about music is that some comes in and some stays outside, which is a very MacDonald way of phrasing it. So some of it kind of affects you and, stirs you, and some of it just doesn't do anything for you. But he did write hymns. He wrote hymns and songs, as I mentioned. So he wrote the texts. Many of his poems are labeled as songs. He didn't write music for them, obviously, not being able to speak that language. But I do think he had a musical ear, and I think that is evident in his work as a literary scholar, the way that he writes about poetry. And I think even his writing, I think you have these moments where he's describing something in a very, very musical way. And it obviously spoke to him. Music spoke to him from the descriptions of music that he write, like the kind of impressions that he is trying to put down to match the music that he hears. He liked Beethoven. He writes that Beethoven is the prince of musicians, which is appropriate given that his writing about music indicates that he was very much in sympathy with a more romantic tradition of music. So the kind of focus on the subjective, the individual experience of music, whether that's composing music or listening to it, the emphasis on feeling, the connections with nature, all of that kind of fits in with MacDonald's understanding of music. And if you look at, Beethoven is, I know, sometimes categorized as classical and sometimes romantic. I think I would see him more as the kind of beginning of the romantic genius kind of, Yeah, so that's a kind of, whistle stop summary of a little bit of background on MacDonald and music.
And one thing that I've discovered from my initial steps into the MacDonald community, the fan clubs, the Facebook groups, is that he seems to have inspired an awful lot of music.
Yes, yeah.
There's a good amount of that in the Lewis world, but it's kind of dwarfed by what I see in the MacDonald world. People taking as much of his stuff as they possibly can and putting it to music, or just reading his books and then being inspired.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think Holst wrote a suite on Fantasties. I'm not sure. So much of this I haven't been able to find, the actual music, or it isn't being performed necessarily, but there are also some MacDonald songs that have been set to music. And it's generally Fantasties, I think, or some of his fairy stories. And so, which makes sense to me because they are, I might talk it a little bit if it's okay about the relationship between Fantasties and music, but they do lend themselves. They're very evocative and, his fairy stories. So it makes sense that they might inspire musical composition.
Well, your work has focused on MacDonald as a literary scholar. So how does that cross over with music? Where do music and literature meet?
Yes, yeah. I guess music plays a big part in MacDonald's thinking about poetry in particular. So verse form. This is not always the case amongst literary scholars, but for MacDonald, he kind of insists very strongly and repeatedly that poetry has to be musical. That's kind of a really it's a characteristic of poetry. And he calls prosody, so the way that poetry communicates its meaning, he talks about the way that poetry communicates its meaning through the prosody, so through the patterns of rhythm and sound, as word music. And he says in his lectures that the music of verse is essential to it. And he kind of insists that the study of sound in verse is of the greatest importance. So it's not just sort of trying to decode a poem in order to figure out what's this person saying. It doesn't work like that. You kind of have to take the whole thing. And that was a huge part of MacDonald's approach as a literary scholar. So he was, for the student of literature, he wanted a person to be informed about some, possibly biographical context of a writer or historical context, to pay attention to, obviously, language, the meaning, words, and so on, maybe the history, the etymology of words. But he really wanted you to also have, I guess, an encounter really with the text and with the works of literature. So not, allow it to affect you in some way, allow it to kind of hit you emotionally or affectively. And this is where the musical element of it comes into play, because he was trying to invite his students, his listeners, if he was giving a lecture, his readers, into the same experience that he was having, so trying to draw attention to that. So he would often read, when he was giving lectures, he would often read things out. And we have these reports, these kind of newspaper reports from all over, mostly in Britain, but also he did a lecture tour in North America. So we have some articles and reviews and things from that. And they're always talking about the way he reads the poetry out. And so you really get the sense that he wants to help you get at the meaning of it intellectually, but also have just to really appreciate the aesthetic element of the literary work. So some of the work that I've done on MacDonald and poetry has been focused on Tennyson, which makes sense because Tennyson's kind of famously or infamously very musical poet. And people have debated whether that is, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So the poet W.H. Auden wrote that Tennyson had the finest ear, perhaps, of any English poet. He was undoubtedly the stupidest, which I think is is a bit harsh.
Harsh.
Yeah. But, but MacDonald loves this about Tennyson. He loves the musicality of his poetry. Personally, I do too. I think he's a lot of fun to read out. So he writes quite a bit about the musicality of Tennyson's poetry and what kind of experience that brings you into. And part of the reason that he emphasizes that the musicality of poetry is because of his understanding of the relationship between music and feeling. So music, again, this is kind of picking up on the romantic, big R romantic ideas of music. Music is this kind of natural and direct expression of feeling for him. So it's a way of communicating that can kind of bypass the intellect and just get right to your heart. You can almost, speak heart to heart in a way through music. We can ask a lot of questions about whether that's actually how music works, but this is MacDonald's understanding of it. And for him, there's a really a kind of fundamentally theological element to that, because in his thinking, it's not primarily through the intellect that a person can gain knowledge of God, spiritual knowledge, whether about God or about a person's relationship with God or, understanding of themselves. That doesn't primarily happen through the intellect, but through feeling. And part of the reason for this is his belief that God created all things out of his heart of love. So this kind of imaginative, creative act of love is how everything came into being. And he characterizes God as the first of artists, and nature is his artwork that is communicating to us all the time some, good things about him. And I'd like to slightly, just in a parenthetical way, just say MacDonald wasn't against the intellect by any means. And he wasn't against kind of propositional forms of knowledge, statements about God, obviously. But he was, again, I think this goes back to his upbringing. He was kind of responding to modes of thought that tended to privilege these intellectual, forms of thinking, forms of knowledge over the feeling, seeing feeling as a source, not seeing feeling as a source of knowledge, not seeing it as indicating something about who God is. And so therefore you kind of end up with this impoverished idea of God. So that might, I don't know if that's a bit vague, but if we kind of think back to the novel that I mentioned earlier, Robert Falconer, the one with the boy who has the violin, he repeatedly throughout the book it's his experiences in nature, his playing of the violin or his hearing somebody playing the piano or playing the violin, some kind of an experience of music. And then once he gets his hands on some exciting, imaginative reading, which is the Arabian Nights, is like the first thing that he gets to read. This is where he kind of has these encounters with something beautiful and transcendent and imaginative that open him up in some way. His grandmother is afraid of that, and so she's much more interested in kind of, the more intellectual, even though it's kind of going against what she's feeling. She's more committed to these intellectual forms of knowledge, and so she kind of shuts those doors on her grandson. And there's another character in the novel who he's the cobbler who teaches Robert to play. He's a fiddler, and he teaches him to play the violin. And he's a bit of a disreputable character. He's an alcoholic who is violent towards his wife, and he's kind of always grimy, and obviously he's a fiddler, so no good can come from that. But the thing that's kind of clear in the novel is that he ends up passing away at a point in the novel. But the thing that's clear is that even despite all of this kind of mess that his life is in and his marriage is in, and so it's the music that kind of keeps something in him open, and he's able to be kind of redeemed at the end of his life in the narrative. So MacDonald very much saw, these links between music and feeling, and then also word music and poetry, as saying something about reality, the kind of deepest reality, but also as a kind of way of keeping us open to that reality, even if we're not conscious of it, even if intellectually we're not sure what's going on with that. It's still kind of keeping the doors open, I would say, as it were, to something divine. So that's kind of his, a theological or spiritual work of music that MacDonald seems to be going on.
And Lewis fans listening will be hearing all kinds of echoes all over the place in Lewis's work. The idea that we shouldn't use works of art, but receive them. The fact that Lewis wrote for the ear, that he wrote with a dip pen specifically as he was sounding out the words. And we just read his letters to children, and it's one of his pieces of advice, to write for the ear. Everything that you just said was struck through with Sehnsucht, the idea of longing.
Yes.
And
yes,
very often the Sehnsucht experiences that we read about in Lewis, either from his biographical information or in his stories, is very often through aesthetic experiences. And this was his big source of contention with Owen Barfield as he was moving from his materialism into being open to the supernatural. It was the question of the role of the imagination. He never went quite so far as Barfield, but he certainly began to see that this had a crucial role in what it meant to be human, what it meant to actually truly grasp something, not just something with the mind, but also with the heart.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that you're saying it, I can see the other way around. I think in the other way around, I can.
Yeah, well, to paraphrase Professor Kirk, it's in MacDonald. It's all in MacDonald. I say, what do they teach them in these schools?
I agree. There's one thing I'm curious about. Maybe some of your Lewis people can give insight into this. So I know from reading, I'm not a Lewis scholar, but I've read a little bit of his stuff, and I've gone and looked at some of his letters and things. And I know that he was always running around, he was so excited whenever he found a MacDonald somewhere, because nothing was in print. And so he'd go to used bookshops, and is his friend Arthur, is that right?
Arthur Greaves. Yeah, when he wrote to him
Arthur
immediately
Greaves.
As soon as he found Fantastic, he's like, forget what you're doing.
Yes.
Go get this book now.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So I remember reading these letters to Arthur Greaves and him being like, I found a MacDonald. And I'm so curious because they're both literary critics. And I'm curious whether he would have had access to some of MacDonald's literary, like A Dish of Orts, that book with the literary essays on Shakespeare. I would be so curious to know about that because, there's enough in MacDonald's fiction where he talks about kind of the way that there are always characters who are sort of learning about how to read, and there are tutors who are instructing other characters. So you get enough of it in his novels to kind of pick up on that. But I'm always so curious about how much what Lewis read of MacDonald, apart from some of the things that I know, like some of his sermons and realist novels. So if anyone has an answer for me, I would love to hear.
Well, they almost certainly have all of his MacDonald books at the Wade Center. So next time I'm there, I'm going to try and get that answer for you.
Okay, that's good. I'm actually going there for the MacDonald conference in a few months.
Wonderful. Well, there you go.
I'm
sure Laura can sort you out.
That would be great.
Well, MacDonald is arguably most famous for his fairy tales and fantasy novels, such as The Golden Key, which we gifted as an audiobook to all of our Patreon supporters. And my personal opinion, I think that's the best way to begin MacDonald. And also Fantastes, the book which baptized Lewis's imagination and which I do not think is the best way to be introduced to MacDonald. It's just a bit too much stuff going on in that one. But what was the role of music in fantasy in general and for MacDonald in particular?
Oh my goodness. So he's got an essay, a short-ish essay called The Fantastic Imagination, where he kind of talks about his theory of the fairy tale, or what he thinks a fairy tale should do. And in that, he compares fairy tale with music. So if it's okay, I'm just going to read a little quote because I think it will give you a good summary of you get to hear a little bit of MacDonald, and it's a good summary.
In a Scottish brogue, please.
Oh, no, I couldn't do that. That would be so offensive to so many people. So the true fairy tale is, to my mind, very like the sonata. We all know that a sonata means something. And where there is the faculty of talking with suitable vagueness and choosing metaphor sufficiently loose, mind may approach mind in the interpretation of a sonata, with the result of a more or less contenting consciousness of sympathy. It's a difficult sentence because he just uses commas. So there's a lot going on there. So essentially, we all know the music means something. And if we talk about it vaguely enough, we can kind of be on the same page, like, oh yeah, this is kind of sad, or this is sort of reminds me of a spring day, or, whatever. But you can't get too specific. He goes on to write that you can't be too specific because the experience of music is so subjective that we're never going to agree on what it means. Or if we tried to put it into words, it wouldn't work. And he compares this with nature. He talks, nature is mood engendering, thought provoking. Such ought the sonata, and such ought the fairy tale to be. It's supposed to evoke something. It's supposed to make you think, or, as he says elsewhere, wake things up in you. He goes on in the essay to answer the people who might be worried, but then you can kind of make it say anything you want it to mean if it doesn't have a meaning, if you can't kind of nail down the meaning. And he's not fussed about that. He's very happy for people to find their own meanings in his fairy tales. Similarly, trying to nail down the meaning of a piece of music is similarly challenging. And he writes, if a writer's aim be logical conviction, he must spare no logical pains, not merely to be understood, but to escape being misunderstood. So if you're writing a sermon or an essay or something, make sure you're not misunderstood. However, where his object is to move by suggestion, to cause to imagine, then let him assail the soul of his reader as the wind assails an Aeolian harp. So we have this image of the Aeolian harp, which is a harp that's played by the wind. And this idea of the music in the words assailing the reader in a kind of positive way. And there's a link here, I think, with the Holy Spirit. So this idea of the wind in nature playing the Aeolian harp, and elsewhere in his, I don't just kind of like pick that out of nowhere, and elsewhere in his writings, he kind of connects spirit with this kind of movement that's going on within a person. That's kind of how he approaches his philosophy of the fairy tale, I guess you would say. It's something that is supposed to be evocative. It's supposed to be musical to some, in that sense. It's supposed to move your heart rather than moving your intellect. Maybe this will help a little bit if anybody is wanting to try and engage with Fantastes a little bit. Always pay attention to the epigraphs. MacDonald is very Victorian in his use of epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter. They're little quotations and they are clues. And at the very beginning of the book, he's got a pretty chunky quotation from Novalis. It's in German. My edition has a translation. Some of them don't, but you could probably easily find a translation. And Novalis, this quote from Novalis talks about, so he talks, one can imagine stories without rational cohesion and yet filled with associations like dreams, and poems that are merely lovely sounding, full of beautiful words, but also without rational sense and connections. So he goes on and then talks about nature being poetic, and again, comparing it to music. So fairy story is like a vision without rational connections, a harmonious whole of miraculous things and events, as, for example, a musical fantasia, the harmonic sequence of an Aeolian harp, again, and indeed nature itself. So you can see where MacDonald is drawing some of these ideas from. And I think if you approach Fantastes with that in mind, with this quotation, it could help a little bit if you have the patience to read it with that kind of, trying to put on hold your analytical brain. It's very difficult. I am not very good at this.
Oh, absolutely exhausting. That was the mistake I made and my wife made when we started trying to read Fantastes.
Yeah.
At the end of each chapter, like, okay, what did that mean? And we immediately tried to allegorize everything.
Yeah,
and that was just exhausting. It was much better just to treat it like an impressionistic painting and let it wash over you.
Yes, exactly.
And seeing what residue was left in your soul and mind at the end of it.
Yes.
What did that do to me? What sorts of things were we thinking about?
Yes, absolutely. It's such a good way of doing it. And I think if you think about Lewis, even the imagery that he uses he talks about like the atmosphere of Fantastes, and he talks about it baptizing him, and this. It's very, he's not giving his analysis of it. He's talking about his impressions of it when he's reading. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably the best way. Easier said than done.
Absolutely. But the Lewis reference, that was at the back of my head. Kappa element in a romance, I think the essay is called. And also the Planet Narnia hypothesis that the Narnian Chronicles are all meant to represent different planets in the spheres of the seven heavens. And there, it's all about you're meant to be living and breathing Jupiter or Saturn and really get a feel for it rather than just a simplistic allegory.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So there's something to that, I think. So we have music in the way that he's sort of, I don't even know if structuring is the right word, because I think these musical ideas that inform the kinds of things he wants to evoke or the kinds of impression that he wants to make potentially on the reader, or invite the reader into this space that is, in that sense, is very musical. When they're reading Fantastes or, some of the other fairy tales, I think the Golden Key, probably you could say the same thing. That has a bit more of a clear, maybe narrative arc, but still, there's some crazy stuff in there that's wonderful. And you kind of are left going, what is this? Which is why I love MacDonald, because, he's a little difficult to pin down, I would say. You also have within these books, within Fantastes and other fairy tales, depictions of a link between music and the ineffable and the transcendent. So something, again, this goes back to what you were saying, David, about the Sehnsucht thing, the kind of fleeting experience of something that we can't quite grasp hold of and we can't quite put into words. And music acts as a kind of metaphor for this in MacDonald's writing and in his fairy tales. So he'll often describe a character listening to music, or the narrator, it's first person narrator. He'll say, I heard this kind of music, and it sounded a bit like this, and it kind of meant something like this. And then he puts one of those songs in that you were talking about earlier. And it never quite does it. He can describe this exquisite music, and you can feel it. And then he'll put, the song lyrics in, and unfortunately, they don't always quite live up to the hype of what he's just said. But one of my favorite scenes where this happens is, and I think this is something that he can do very specifically in a fairy tale that you wouldn't be able to do, in a realist novel. So in The Princess and Curdie, which is the second princess book after The Princess and the Goblin, the little boy Curdie is going to find the great-great-grandmother who lives up in the attic somewhere in this castle that the princess has grown up in. And the great-great-grandmother is some kind of divine figure. She's sort of an image of God in some way. And she has this spinning wheel that she works at all the time. So Curdy kind of goes up and hears the sound of the spinning wheel, and he knocks on the door, and he has this conversation with her. And all the time she's spinning away, and it's making this incredible music. And she tells him to listen to it and to see, can you understand what the spinning wheel is saying to you? And he's having this, transcendent experience of beauty listening to this music. But it always just slips away from him, that he can't quite put his finger on what she's trying to communicate to him. And so she said, "Did you understand?" after she finishes. And he says, "Oh no, I almost got it, but I just couldn't quite get it." And she goes, "No, I think you got it more than you think you did." And she says, "Shall I tell you what the spinning wheel has been telling you and what you've been telling me in return?" And so there's a sense in which his delight and his experience listening to that music is his response. And she's understood that. And I think you can see that as a form of prayer, because, there's a kind of wordless communication that's going on with this divine figure who is attempting to communicate something to him. And even though the little boy doesn't know it himself, what's going on, he is responding, openly in some way. And she gets it. She understands, what he's saying. So I think there's some really beautiful imagery that, MacDonald uses, some of these little scenes and things throughout his fantasy work that you wouldn't be able to do in a realist novel. But I think he does it really in a really lovely way in his fairy tales.
Dr. Amanda Vernon, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
As the landlord rings the bell for final drinks, can you tell people where they can find out more about you?
Oh, yes. I mean, you could check out my Instagram if you would like. I have some links on there to some pieces that I've written. My handle is av.writes, W-R-I-T-E-S.
Wonderful. Well, as we get in our final drinks, I'd like to thank our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, our intern, Julia. Thanks to all the listeners and patron supporters, particularly the top tier supporters, Mary Margaret, Aldo, Alex, James, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Bud1, Bud2, Shane K, Paul, Gary, Stephen Kelly, Chris, John, James K, Peter, David, Angela, and Rowdy. We pray for our listeners and all the prayer requests in our Slack channel every Tuesday. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it on social media and maybe take a few minutes today and listen to a really nice piece of music and see how you feel at the end of it. And please join us next time when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Prost!
Prost!